The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched out like a massive crystal bowl, its walls glowing with soft blue light. Hundreds of alien delegates filled the curved seats, their various forms creating a sea of colors and shapes. Some had scales that shimmered like oil on water, others had feathers that moved with their breathing, and a few had skin that seemed to be made of living stone. At the center of it all stood Commander Vexthal of the Corvani Empire. His body was tall and angular, covered in what looked like natural armor made of dark crystal. 3 eyes sat in a triangle on his face, each one a different shade of purple. Scars ran across his chest and arms, telling stories of battles fought across the galaxy. When he moved, his joints clicked softly like breaking glass. The commander had asked to speak to the council about something he called urgent. Now he stood waiting, his 3 eyes scanning the crowd. Most of the delegates looked bored. A few whispered to each other, probably wondering why they had to listen to another war story. In the observer section, 2 humans sat quietly. Captain Jake Morrison was a man in his 40s with gray hair and tired eyes. Next to him, Lieutenant Amy Watson was younger, with brown hair pulled back in a simple style. They wore the dark blue uniforms of the Earth Defense Force, which looked plain compared to the elaborate clothing of the alien delegates. Chancellor Zephyrin, the leader of the Galactic Council, raised one of his 4 arms. He was a member of the stellar race, with skin that looked like it contained tiny stars. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the hall. Commander Vexthal, you have requested this emergency session to discuss what you call the human problem. The council is listening. A ripple of what sounded like laughter went through the crowd. Several delegates turned to look at the 2 humans, and their expressions were not kind. One alien that looked like a giant insect clicked its mandibles in what might have been amusement. Vexthal did not smile. His 3 eyes focused on the Chancellor. Thank you, Chancellor. I know many of you think this is a waste of time. You look at these humans and see primitive mammals, soft creatures who barely learned to travel between stars 50 years ago. You think they are harmless. The commander paused, letting his words sink in. 3 years ago, I thought the same thing. I was wrong, dead wrong. And if this council makes the same mistake, we will all pay for it. A delegate from the Nexari Federation stood up. His blue skin was covered in what looked like flowing water. Commander, with respect, we have studied these humans. They have no natural weapons, no armor, no telepathic abilities. They die if they do not breathe their specific air mixture. How can such weak beings be a threat to civilizations that have ruled the galaxy for thousands of years? Captain Morrison shifted in his seat but said nothing. His face showed no emotion, but his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. Vexthal turned to face the Nexari delegate. That is exactly what I said when I first encountered them. I commanded a battle fleet of 12 ships. The humans had 1 small colony on a contested world. I expected them to surrender within hours. Instead, they fought for 3 months. And when it was over, my fleet was scattered, my reputation was in ruins, and I had learned to fear a species I had never taken seriously. The hall grew quieter. Some delegates leaned forward in their seats. I have fought the Zephyrian Horde, Vexthal continued, his voice growing stronger. I have faced the machine armies of the Synthetic Collective. I have battled creatures that could tear apart a starship with their bare hands. But none of them prepared me for what humans are capable of when they decide to fight. Chancellor Zephyrn's star-like skin seemed to dim slightly. Commander, you speak of 1 battle. Surely you do not mean to suggest that these humans pose a threat to the entire galactic community? I speak of more than 1 battle, Chancellor. I speak of a war that lasted 2 years. A war that changed everything I thought I knew about combat, about strategy, about what it means to be a warrior. I speak of the Void War, fought in the Outer Rim territories, where human forces faced 3 different alien militaries and did not just survive, they won. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Several delegates stood up, talking loudly in their various languages. The insect-like alien from before was no longer clicking in amusement. Impossible, someone shouted from the back of the hall. The Outer Rim campaigns were classified. How could primitive humans have been involved? Vexthel waited for the noise to die down. They were involved because they were the ones who started it, and they were the ones who finished it. The three military forces that fought there, the Corvani Empire, the Draconian Hegemony, and the Phantom Syndicate, we all went there to remove what we saw as a minor human infestation. We came back broken, defeated, and forever changed. Lieutenant Watson glanced at Captain Morrison. For the first time, Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "I have requested this session," Vexthel said, his voice now carrying through the silent hall, "because I believe you need to hear what really happened out there. You need to understand what these humans are truly capable of. Not because I want to frighten you, but because I want to save you from making the same mistakes we did." The commander's three eyes swept across the assembled delegates. "You look at humans and see prey. I am here to tell you that they are not prey. They are something far more dangerous. They are prey that learn to hunt. And once they start hunting, they do not stop until their target is dead." Chancellor Zephron's forearms trembled slightly. "Commander, these are serious accusations. You are suggesting that a species that has been part of our galactic community for only 5 decades has somehow become a major military threat." "I am not suggesting it, Chancellor. I am stating it as fact. And I am offering to tell you exactly how it happened, so that you can understand what we are truly dealing with." The hall fell completely silent. Even the usual background humming of the building system seemed to fade away. "Very well, Commander," the Chancellor said finally. "The Council will hear your testimony. But I warn you, if you are wasting our time with exaggerated war stories, there will be consequences." Vexthel's crystalline armor caught the light as he straightened to his full height. "Chancellor, I wish these were just stories. I wish I could tell you that humans are harmless. But I have seen what they can do. I have fought them. I have lost to them, and I have learned to respect them in a way that I have never respected any other species." He paused, looking directly at the two humans in the observer section. "The question is not whether humans are dangerous. The question is whether we are wise enough to learn from my mistakes before it is too late." The commander's three eyes returned to the Council. "Let me tell you about the first time I encountered humans in battle. Let me tell you about the day I learned that everything I thought I knew about war was wrong." Commander Vexthel's three eyes closed for a moment, as if he was seeing something from long ago. When he opened them again, the purple light in them seemed darker. "It was 3 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "I was commanding the 7th Battle Fleet in the Kepler 442 system. 12 ships, including my flagship, the Void Piercer. We were on a routine patrol when our sensors detected unauthorized activity on the 4th planet." The commander's crystalline armor clicked softly as he moved. The planet was officially uninhabited. Rocky, cold, but with decent mineral deposits. According to our records, no species had claimed it. But our long-range scans showed structures on the surface, buildings, mining equipment, ships. Several delegates leaned forward in their seats. This was the kind of story they understood: territory disputes, resource conflicts, the normal business of galactic politics. When we moved closer, we discovered the intruders were human. A small colony, maybe 2,000 people. They had been there for 6 months, mining rare metals and building what looked like a permanent settlement. They called it New Hope. In the observer section, Captain Morrison's face remained neutral, but his hands tightened slightly. "The response was obvious," Vexthel continued. "Humans were new to the galaxy. They did not understand the rules. They needed to be taught their place. I sent a standard message to their leader, a human named Colonel Ben Murphy. I explained that they were trespassing on Corvani territory and had 24 hours to evacuate." The commander paused, looking around the hall. "I expected immediate compliance. Humans had no military presence in that sector. My fleet could have turned their entire colony into glass in minutes. Any rational species would have packed up and left." Chancellor Zephron shifted in his seat. "I assume they did not comply?" "They replied within an hour," Vexthel said. Colonel Murphy sent a message that was polite but firm. He said they had surveyed the planet thoroughly and found no signs of previous habitation. He said they had followed all proper procedures for claiming an uninhabited world. He said they would be happy to discuss sharing the planet's resources, but they would not abandon their colony. A few delegates made sounds of disapproval. The insect-like alien clicked its mandibles angrily. I was annoyed but not surprised, the commander continued. New species often test boundaries. I decided to make a show of force. I moved my fleet into low orbit and began targeting their main settlement. I sent another message, this time with visual evidence of my weapons trained on their buildings. Vexthal's 3 eyes dimmed slightly. Colonel Murphy's response was immediate. He appeared on my view screen, and I got my first good look at a human in a combat situation. He was a male, middle-aged by their standards, with short brown hair and calm blue eyes. He wore a simple uniform with no decorations. The commander's voice grew quieter. He said something I will never forget. He said, "Commander, I understand. You have superior firepower. But before you use it, you should know that we have families here, children, we have built homes. We have planted crops. We are not leaving. If you want this planet, you will have to take it from us." The hall was completely silent now. Even the usual background sounds seemed to have stopped. I thought he was bluffing, Vexthal continued. I activated my weapons and destroyed one of their outer buildings. It was empty, just a storage facility, but the message was clear. I expected immediate surrender. The commander's armor clinked as he shook his head. Instead, something happened that I had never seen before. The humans did not panic. They did not run. They began to move with purpose. Within minutes, I watched them disappear into prepared positions. They had been planning for this moment. Lieutenant Watson glanced at Captain Morrison, who nodded slightly. I ordered my ground forces to deploy, Vexthal said. 5,000. Corvani warriors, the best in the fleet. They were equipped with energy weapons, personal shields, and full combat armor. They had fought in dozens of campaigns across the galaxy. They were professionals. The commander's 3 eyes focused on a point in the distance. The humans had maybe 400 people who could fight. The rest were civilians, scientists, engineers, families. They had basic projectile weapons and mining equipment. No shields, no energy weapons, no proper armor. By every military doctrine in the galaxy, they should have been crushed in hours. But they were not? Chancellor Zephyron asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. They were not, Vexthal confirmed. The first thing they did was something I had never encountered before. They disappeared. Not literally, they used the terrain. The buildings, the mining tunnels, they turned their entire colony into a fortress. Every structure became a firing position. Every tunnel became a trap. The commander began pacing slowly. My warriors advanced expecting a traditional battle. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to fight fair. The humans would appear, attack, and vanish before my forces could respond. They used their mining explosives to collapse tunnels, trapping my warriors underground. They rigged their own buildings with bombs and let my forces occupy them before detonating them. Several delegates made uncomfortable sounds. But the most disturbing thing was their leader, Colonel Murphy. He was everywhere at once. While my warriors fought his soldiers, he was talking to them. Not just giving orders, encouraging them, reminding them what they were fighting for. He knew every person in that colony by name. He knew their families, their stories, their fears. Vexthal stopped pacing and faced the council directly. On the second day, I captured one of their soldiers. A young female named Dr. Lisa Carter. She was wounded but not broken. I interrogated her personally, expecting to learn about their weaknesses, their plans, their fears. The commander's 3 eyes seemed to glow brighter. Instead, she told me about her daughter, a human child, 8 years old, who had drawn pictures of the alien landscape and hung them in their home. She told me about the garden they had planted, how excited the children were to see earth plants growing in alien soil. She told me about the future they were building. The hall remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of boredom or skepticism. It was the silence of beings beginning to understand something they had not expected. Then she asked me a question that I still think about, Vexthel continued. She asked me if I had children, if I had a home, if I understood what it meant to fight for something more important than orders or territory. The commander's armor caught the light as he straightened. I released her that night. Not because I was weak, but because I was beginning to understand that I was not fighting soldiers. I was fighting people who had something to lose, something they valued more than their own lives. Chancellor Zephron's star-like skin seemed to pulse slowly. Commander, you speak as if this was unusual. All soldiers fight for their homes, their families. No, Chancellor, Vexthel said firmly. Soldiers fight because they are ordered to. These humans fought because they chose to. There is a difference that took me 3 months to understand and 3 years to accept. The commander's 3 eyes swept across the assembled delegates. What happened on that planet was not a battle. It was a lesson about what happens when you threaten something that humans truly care about. He paused, letting his words sink in. Tomorrow I will tell you about the siege that followed, about how these primitive humans taught a veteran commander that everything he thought he knew about war was wrong. Commander Vexthel stood quietly for a moment, his 3 eyes reflecting the soft light of the council chamber. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of painful memory. The siege of New Hope lasted 3 months, he began. 3 months that changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. What started as a simple territorial dispute became something else entirely. It became my education in human nature. The commander's crystalline armor clinked softly as he shifted his weight. After the first week, I realized that traditional tactics would not work. The humans had turned their entire colony into a weapon. Every building, every tunnel, every piece of equipment served their defense. But that was not the worst part. Several delegates leaned forward, their various forms of attention focused on the Corvani warrior. The worst part was that they were learning, Vexthel continued. Every day they adapted to our attacks. Every night they improved their defenses. They studied our weapons, our tactics, our weaknesses. They learned faster than any species I had ever encountered. Chancellor. Zephron's star-like skin pulsed slowly. Commander, surely you exaggerate. Learning takes time, resources, proper education. That is what I thought, Vexthel replied. But humans do not learn the way we do. They learn by doing. They learn by failing. They learn by dying, and each lesson makes them stronger. The commander began pacing again, his movements controlled but restless. By the second week, they had figured out how to disable our energy weapons. Not through technology, they had no advanced equipment. They used water, mud, and metal fragments. Simple things that made our sophisticated weapons useless. In the observer section, Captain Morrison allowed himself a small smile. Lieutenant Watson remained motionless, but her eyes never left the commander. Their leader, Colonel Murphy, divided his people into small groups. Each group had a specific job. Some fought. Some built traps. Some gathered intelligence. Some took care of the wounded. But all of them understood the larger plan. Vexthel stopped pacing and faced the council directly. I began to intercept their communications. I expected to find fear, confusion, maybe surrender negotiations. Instead, I found something that disturbed me deeply. They were talking about home, about their families, about the future they were building. They spoke of death not as an ending, but as a price they were willing to pay. The commander's 3 eyes seemed to dim. On the 15th day, I met their field commander, a human named Captain Steve Rogers. He was young, maybe 30 years, old, with bright green eyes and a quick smile. He had been a farmer before the colony was established. He knew nothing about military tactics. Several delegates made sounds of confusion. How could an untrained farmer command troops against a professional military? Captain Rogers requested a meeting under a flag of truce. Vexthel continued. I agreed, thinking he wanted to discuss surrender terms. Instead, he wanted to show me something. He took me to their medical center where their wounded were being treated. The commander's voice grew quieter. I expected to see broken spirits, defeated soldiers ready to give up. Instead, I saw humans who had lost limbs, lost blood, lost friends, but had not lost hope. They were making jokes. They were planning their next attacks. They were teaching each other new ways to fight. The hall was completely silent. Even the usual background sounds seemed muted. Captain Rogers introduced me to a woman named Sergeant Maria Gonzalez. She was their explosives expert, though she had been a teacher before the colony. She had lost her left arm in one of our attacks. She was learning to use her right hand to build bombs more effectively. Vexthel's armor caught the light as he gestured. She looked at me with no fear, no hatred, just curiosity. She asked me about my homeworld, about my family, about what I was fighting for. When I could not answer, she told me about her students, about the children she had taught who were now hiding in the tunnels below. The commander's three eyes focused on a point in the distance. She said something that I will never forget. She said, "Commander, you can kill us all, but you cannot kill what we are building here. You cannot kill the idea that ordinary people can create something extraordinary." When they work together, Chancellor Zephron's trembled slightly. "Commander, these are touching stories, but surely they do not explain military victory." "Do they not?" Vexthel asked, his voice sharp. "Let me tell you about the third week. My forces had surrounded their main settlement. We had cut off their supply lines. We had destroyed their communications. We had them trapped. By every military manual in the galaxy, they should have surrendered." The commander's pace quickened. Instead, they did something I had never seen before. They went underground. Not just hiding, they had been preparing for this moment from the beginning. They had built an entire network of tunnels, supply caches, and hidden positions. They had turned the planet itself into their ally. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their engineer, a man named Paul Johnson, had been studying our technology from the beginning. He had figured out how to hack our communication systems. Suddenly, my forces were receiving false orders. My supply ships were being misdirected. My tactical plans were being intercepted and countered before I could implement them. Vexthel's three eyes glowed brighter. But the most disturbing thing was their psychological warfare. They did not just fight our bodies, they fought our minds. They would leave messages for my troops, personal messages, messages that showed they knew our names, our ranks, our fears. The commander stopped pacing and faced the council directly. They had studied us. Not just our weapons or our tactics, but us. They understood our psychology better than we understood theirs. They knew that Corvani warriors value honor above life. So they challenged our honor. They made us question why we were fighting. In the observer section, Lieutenant Watson finally allowed herself a small smile. By the fourth week, I was losing troops not to death, but to doubt, Vexthel continued. My soldiers were asking questions. Why were we attacking families? Why were we destroying a peaceful colony? What glory was there in crushing farmers and teachers? The commander's voice grew heavy. The humans had turned our own values against us. They had made us see ourselves through their eyes. And what we saw was not heroic warriors defending the Empire. We saw bullies attacking the innocent. Chancellor Zephron's star-like skin seemed to pulse faster. "Commander, you speak as if these humans possessed some form of mind control." "Not mind control," Vexthel replied. "Something far more dangerous. They possessed something we had forgotten. They possessed the ability to make others believe in their cause. They fought not just with weapons, but with ideas, with hope, with, the unshakable belief that they were defending something worth dying for." The commander's three eyes swept across the assembled delegates. By the end of the first month, I realized that I was not fighting a military force. I was fighting an entire civilization. Every human in that colony was a soldier, a strategist, a weapon. They had turned their weakness into strength, their desperation into determination. He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened next changed everything. Not just for me, but for every species that dared to underestimate what humans could become when they refused to surrender. The hall remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer the silence of skepticism. It was the silence of beings beginning to understand that they might have made a terrible mistake. Tomorrow, Vexthel said quietly, I will tell you about the price of pushing humans too far. About what happens when you take everything they have left to lose, about the moment when prey becomes predator. Commander Vexthel's three eyes closed, and for a moment the council chamber was completely silent. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. The professional soldier was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. What I am about to tell you, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, is the darkest moment of my military career. It is the moment when I learned that there are some lines that should never be crossed, and some enemies that should never be awakened. The commander's crystalline armor seemed to grow darker as he spoke. After 6 weeks of siege, my superiors grew impatient. The Corvani High Command sent new orders. They wanted the human problem solved quickly and permanently. They wanted an example made. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had all heard stories of what happened when the galaxy's major powers decided to make examples. The orders were simple, Vexthel continued. If the humans would not surrender, I was to destroy them from orbit, complete sterilization. Number. Survivors, no witnesses, no future problems. In the observer section, Captain Morrison's hands clenched into fists. Lieutenant Watson's face remained calm, but her eyes had gone cold. I argued against it, the commander said. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, families. They had children, but my superiors were clear. The humans needed to learn their place in the galaxy. Other species needed to see what happened to those who defied the Corvani Empire. Vexthel began pacing again, his movements jerky and agitated. I gave Colonel Murphy one final chance. I told him about the orbital bombardment order. I told him his people had fought bravely, but that continued resistance meant death for everyone. I begged him to surrender. The commander's three eyes focused on the floor. He listened to my message in silence. Then he asked me a question that still haunts me. He asked if I had children. When I said yes, he asked if I would abandon them to save myself. When I said no, he told me he had his answer. The hall was so quiet that individual breathing could be heard. The bombardment began. At dawn, Vexthel said, his voice flat and emotionless. Precision strikes on their main settlement. Their power generators, their communication centers, their medical facilities. Everything that made their colony possible. The commander stopped pacing and faced the council directly. I expected it to be over quickly. Clean, military. Instead, I watched something that changed me forever. I watched ordinary people face certain death with a courage I had never seen before. Chancellor Zephron's star-like skin had grown dim. Commander, orbital bombardment is a recognized military tactic. Surely you cannot blame yourself for following orders. Cannot I? Vexthel asked, his voice sharp. Let me tell you what happened next. Let me tell you about the survivors. The commander's three eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. When the bombardment ended, I sent ground forces to confirm the destruction. What they found was not what we expected. The humans had not just built tunnels, they had built an entire underground city. Hundreds of them had survived. Several delegates made sounds of surprise. Underground cities were advanced engineering, not something primitive colonists should have been able to build. Their leader was no longer Colonel Murphy, Vexthel continued. He had died in the bombardment, along with most of the original colonists. The survivors were led by a man named Lieutenant Commander Alex Turner. He had been their communications officer. A quiet man who had lost his wife and daughter in the attack. The commander's voice grew darker. When I saw him, I understood that something fundamental had changed. The humans I had fought before had been defending their homes. These survivors had nothing left to defend. They had only one purpose left: revenge. The hall grew colder somehow, as if the temperature had dropped. Turner's first message to me was simple, Vexthal said. He told me that the rules had changed, that the humans were no longer interested in negotiation or surrender, that they were going to teach the galaxy what happened when you killed human children. The commander's armor clinked as he gestured. I thought it was empty threat. What could a few hundred survivors do against a battle fleet? I was about to learn that I had not just created enemies, I had created something far more dangerous. Vexthal. Three eyes focused on a point in the distance. The survivors had been joined by someone new. A woman named Dr. Helen Ross. She had been an anthropologist before the colony, someone who studied different species and cultures. The bombardment had changed her too. The commander's voice grew quieter. Dr. Ross had spent the siege studying U.S., not just our weapons or our tactics, but our psychology, our culture, our fears. She understood Corvani society better than most Corvani, and she began to teach the other survivors everything she had learned. Lieutenant Watson leaned forward, slightly in her seat, her expression intense. Within days, the survivors began a campaign unlike anything I had ever encountered, Vexthal continued. They did not attack our ships or our bases, they attacked our minds. They sent messages to my crews, personal messages that showed they knew our names, our families, our home planets. The commander's pace quickened. They had somehow accessed our personnel files. They knew which of my soldiers had children. They knew which ones had lost comrades in previous battles. They knew which ones questioned the mission. And they used that knowledge like a weapon. Several delegates looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. The messages were not threats, Vexthal said. They were worse. They were truths. They reminded my soldiers that they were fighting people who had been peaceful colonists. They reminded them that we had killed children. They reminded them that we were the aggressors. The commander's three eyes seemed to burn brighter. But the most disturbing thing was their intelligence network. Somehow, these survivors had learned to monitor our communications. They knew our troop movements before we made them. They knew our supply schedules. They knew our weaknesses. Vexthal stopped pacing and faced the council directly. A human named Private First Class Tony Silva had been their communications specialist. He had survived the bombardment with severe burns over half his body. He should have been in a medical facility. Instead, he was running an intelligence operation that rivals anything the galaxy's major powers could produce. The commander's voice grew heavy. Silva had figured out how to hack our encrypted channels. He was intercepting our orders, our reports, our personal messages. He was learning everything there was to know about the Corvani military structure, and he was sharing that information with the other survivors. Chancellor Zephyrant's forearms trembled. Commander, you speak as if these humans possessed advanced technology. How could colonists have such capabilities? They did not have advanced technology, Vexthal replied. They had something better. They had motivation. They had nothing left to lose. And they had learned that the galaxy's advanced civilizations were not as advanced as they thought. The commander's three eyes swept across the assembled delegates. Within 2 weeks, the survivors had done something that should have been impossible. They had turned my own fleet against me. Not through force or coercion, but through truth. Through making my soldiers understand what they were really fighting for. The hall remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed again. It was no longer the silence of skepticism or even concern. It was the silence of beings beginning to understand that they might be facing something beyond their comprehension. The survivors had become something new, Vexthal continued. They were no longer colonists or farmers or teachers. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. They were humans who had learned to fight not just with weapons, but with ideas, with knowledge. With the understanding that sometimes the greatest victory comes from making your enemy defeat themselves. He paused, letting his words sink in. What happened next was not a battle, it was a lesson. A lesson about what happens when you push a species too far. When you force them to evolve. When you create something that should never have existed. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Tomorrow, I will tell you about the day these survivors stopped being prey and became predators. About the day they taught the galaxy that humans are not just dangerous when they are defending something. They are terrifying when they have nothing left to lose. Commander Vexthal stood motionless for a long moment, his three eyes reflecting something that looked like horror. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a memory that had haunted him for years. What I am about to tell you, he began, is the most difficult part of my testimony. It is the story of how a peaceful species learned to hunt, how humans stopped being victims and became something that terrified the galaxy's most experienced warriors. The commander's crystalline armor caught the light as he moved. 6 months after the bombardment, everything changed. The survivors had vanished from their planet, scattered into space like seeds on the wind. I thought they were gone. I thought the problem was solved. I was wrong. Several delegates leaned forward, their various forms of attention focused completely on the Corvani warrior. The first sign came from the Outer Rim territories, Vexthal continued. Reports of ships being attacked by unknown forces. Not destroyed, but disabled. Their crews left alive, but their weapons and technology stolen. The attacks were precise, surgical, professional. The commander began pacing slowly. At first, we thought it was pirates. The Outer Rim was always dangerous, full of raiders and criminals. But these attacks were different. They followed patterns. They targeted specific technologies. They were learning. In the observer section, Captain Morrison remained still, but his eyes never left the commander. Then came the intelligence reports. Vexthal said, Corvani ships were being hunted by vessels that used our own technology against us. Ships that knew our weaknesses better than we did. Ships that could predict our tactics before we implemented them. The commander's three eyes seemed to glow brighter. The human survivors had not disappeared. They had evolved. Under the leadership of Admiral Patricia Brooks, they had built a fleet. Not from their own technology, but from ours. They had taken everything we had taught them about warfare and improved it. Chancellor Zephron's star-like skin pulsed rapidly. Commander, you speak of impossibility. A few hundred survivors cannot build a fleet capable of threatening established military powers. That is what I thought, Vexthal replied. Until I met Admiral Brooks in battle. She had been Dr. Ross's assistant before the colony, a young woman studying alien cultures. The bombardment had transformed her into something I had never encountered. Before, a human who understood war better than those who had created it. The commander's voice grew darker. Brooks had done something that no military academy in the galaxy teaches. She had learned to think like her enemies while maintaining the advantages of her own species. She could predict our moves because she understood our psychology. But we could not predict hers because human psychology was unlike anything we had encountered. Vexthal stopped pacing and faced the council directly. The first time I faced her fleet, I had 8 ships under my command. She had 3. By every tactical manual ever written, the outcome should have been obvious. Instead, I lost 5 ships and barely escaped with my life. The hall was completely silent, the delegates hanging on every word. Admiral Brooks had taken our own weapons and made them better, the commander continued. She had studied our energy shields and found ways to penetrate them. She had analyzed our hull designs and discovered weak points we did not know existed. She had turned our strengths into weaknesses. The commander's 3 eyes focused on a distant point. But the most terrifying thing was her crew. The human survivors had been joined by others. Humans from other colonies who had heard about the bombardment. They came not for glory or conquest, but for justice. They came to make sure that what happened to New Hope never happened again. Lieutenant Watson's expression remained neutral, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Under Admiral Brooks was General Kevin Mitchell, a man who had been a construction worker before joining the resistance, Vexthal continued. He had learned to wage war the way humans build things. Methodically, efficiently, with an eye toward long-term results. His ground forces were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The commander's pace quickened. Mitchell's troops did not just fight battles. They studied their enemies during combat. Every engagement was a learning experience. Every defeat made them stronger. Every victory taught them something new about their opponents. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The humans had developed what they called pack tactics, Vexthal said. They fought as a single organism, each unit supporting the others, each soldier understanding their role in the larger plan. They moved like predators hunting prey, but with the coordination of a species that had learned to work together to survive. The commander's voice grew heavier. Captain Danny Wright led their Special Operations Forces. He had been a teacher before the colony, someone who educated children. The bombardment had turned him into something that gave my warriors nightmares. He could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before we could respond. Vexthal S. Three eyes seemed to burn with inner fire. Wright's teams did not just attack our military assets. They attacked our confidence, our certainty, our belief that we were the superior force. They made us afraid to sleep, afraid to patrol alone, afraid to trust our own sensors. The commander stopped moving and faced the council directly. But the most dangerous human was Engineer Rachel Kim. She had survived the bombardment by hiding in the deepest tunnels, emerging weeks later to find her world destroyed and her people scattered. She had dedicated her life to understanding our technology better than we understood it ourselves. The hall grew colder, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. Kim could take any piece of alien technology and improve it within days, Vexthal continued. She understood not just how our weapons worked, but why they worked. She could see possibilities that our own engineers had never considered. She turned captured equipment into weapons that were more effective than our originals. The commander's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Within a year, the human resistance had done something that should have been impossible. They had reversed the balance of power. We were no longer hunting them, they were hunting us. Chancellor Zephron's forearms trembled visibly. Commander, you speak of a complete military reversal. How could this happen so quickly? Because humans learn differently than we do, Vexthal replied. We learn through instruction, through tradition, through established doctrine. Humans learn through necessity, through adaptation, through the willingness to abandon everything they thought they knew if it means survival. The commander's three eyes swept across the assembled delegates. The human fleet began targeting Corvani installations across 3 sectors. Not for resources or territory, but to send a message. The message was simple: if you attack human civilians, you will pay a price that makes victory meaningless. Vexthal's armor clinked as he gestured. They did not destroy our bases. They captured them. They did not kill our soldiers. They converted them. They made my own people understand that the humans were not the aggressors. We were, the commander's voice grew heavy with emotion. Admiral Brooks sent me a personal message after her forces captured my supply depot at Kepler Station. She said that humans did not want war, they wanted peace. But if the galaxy insisted on war, then humans would show them what war really meant, when waged by a species that had nothing left to lose. In the observer section, Captain Morrison finally allowed himself a small smile. The human resistance had become something more than a military force, Vexthal continued. They had become an idea. The idea that ordinary people could stand up to the galaxy's greatest powers and win. The idea that justice was more powerful than superior firepower. The commander's 3 eyes closed briefly. By the end of the 2nd year, 3 major military powers were retreating from human space. Not because they had been defeated in battle, but because they had been defeated in spirit. The humans had shown them that some victories come at a cost too high to pay. He opened his eyes and faced the council directly. What the humans accomplished was not just military victory. They had done something far more dangerous. They had proven that the galaxy's established order could be challenged. That superior technology and ancient traditions meant nothing against a species willing to evolve, to adapt, to become whatever they needed to become to survive. The hall remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed one final time. It was no longer the silence of skepticism or concern or even fear. It was the silence of beings who had just realized that everything they thought they knew about power and war and survival was wrong. "Tomorrow," Vexthal said quietly, "I will tell you the truth that terrifies me most. The truth about what humans have become, and what that means for every species in this galaxy." Commander Vexthal stood in the center of the council chamber, his three eyes reflecting the weight of everything he had shared. The assembled delegates sat in complete silence, their various forms motionless as they processed the implications of his testimony. The air itself seemed heavy with understanding. "We come now to the end of my story," the commander began, his voice carrying a finality that made several delegates shift uncomfortably. "We come to the truth that I have spent 3 years trying to understand. The truth about what humans have become, and what that means for all of us." The commander's crystalline armor caught the soft light as he turned to look directly at Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Watson in the observer section. For the first time during his testimony, he seemed to be speaking to them rather than about them. "The Void War lasted 2 years, Vexthal continued, his gaze returning to the council. 2 years during which 3 of the galaxy's most powerful military forces fought against human resistance fighters. When it ended, we had not simply lost battles or territory. We had lost something far more important. We had lost our certainty about our place in the universe." Chancellor Zephyrin's star-like skin had grown dim throughout the testimony. Now it barely glowed at all. "Commander, you have told us a remarkable story of military reversal. But surely, you do not suggest that a few thousand human survivors pose a threat to galactic civilization?" Vexthal's 3 eyes focused on the Chancellor with an intensity that made the chamber grow colder. "A few thousand survivors, Chancellor? Is that what you think this is about? Let me tell you what I learned in those final months of the war. Let me tell you about the moment I realized that we had not just awakened a sleeping giant, we had created one." The commander began his final pace around the chamber, his movements now carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "By the end of the first year, human resistance forces numbered in the tens of thousands," he said. "Not because they had recruited from their original colonies, but because they had done something unprecedented. They had convinced members of other species to join their cause." Several delegates made sounds of disbelief. Interspecies military cooperation was rare and difficult to achieve. Humans had learned to communicate with species that had never spoken to each other, Vexthal continued. They had found common ground between civilizations that had been enemies for centuries. They had created alliances based not on shared interests, but on shared values. The commander's voice grew stronger. Admiral Brooks had been joined by a Centauri engineer who had seen his homeworld strip-mined by corporate interests. General Mitchell worked alongside a draconian strategist whose family had been killed in a territorial dispute. Captain Wright trained soldiers from 6 different species who had all lost something to the galaxy's major powers. In the observer section, Lieutenant Watson's expression had changed from neutral observation to something that looked almost like pride. "But the most disturbing thing was not their military success," Vexthal said. "It was their rate of learning. Every month they became more effective. Every battle taught them something new. Every defeat made them stronger. They were evolving faster than any species I had ever encountered." The commander stopped pacing and faced the council directly. "In the final 6 months of the war, I began to understand what we were really facing. We were not fighting the same species that had first left their homeworld 50 years ago. We were fighting something new, something that had been forged by conflict and shaped by necessity." Chancellor Zephyrin's forearms trembled as he spoke. "Commander, species do not evolve in mere decades. Evolution takes millennia." "Physical evolution? Yes," Vexthal replied. "But humans were not evolving physically. They were evolving culturally, psychologically, strategically. They were becoming something that had never existed before in galactic history, a species that could adapt to any challenge and overcome any obstacle through sheer determination and intelligence." The commander's 3 eyes seemed to burn with inner fire. Let me tell you about the last battle I fought against them. My fleet encountered human forces near the Vega system. I had 12 ships, the latest technology, the best trained crews in the Corvani military. The humans had 7 ships, most of them captured from various alien fleets and modified beyond recognition. The hall was so quiet that individual heartbeats could be heard. The battle lasted 4 hours, Vexthel continued. In those 4 hours, I watched human forces do things that should have been impossible. They coordinated attacks across multiple ship types using communication systems that had never been designed to work together. They used captured alien weapons in combinations that their original creators had never imagined. They fought like a single organism with 12 different brains. The commander's voice dropped to almost a whisper. But the most terrifying thing was their commander. A woman who called herself Captain Sarah Blake. She had been a librarian before the war began, a keeper of books and stories. The conflict had transformed her into a strategic genius who could predict my moves 3 steps ahead. Several delegates made uncomfortable sounds, shifting in their seats as if trying to escape the implications of the commander's words. Captain Blake sent me a message after the battle, Vexthel said. I had lost 8 ships and was retreating with what remained of my fleet. She could have destroyed us completely. Instead, she let us go. Her message was simple. She said that humans did not want to rule the galaxy. They wanted to change it. The commander's 3 eyes swept across the assembled delegates. She told me that humans had learned something during their years of conflict. They had learned that the galaxy's problems were not caused by any single species or government. They were caused by a system that valued power over justice, conquest over cooperation, fear over understanding. Chancellor Zephron's star-like skin had grown so dim it was barely visible. Commander, what are you saying? I am saying that humans have become something we never expected, Vexthel replied. They have become a species that can unite others, that can inspire change, that can show the galaxy a different way of existing. They are not conquerors. They are revolutionaries. The commander's voice grew heavy with finality. The war ended not with human victory, but with human mercy. They could have destroyed our fleets, occupied our worlds, imposed their will on our people. Instead, they offered something no military force in galactic history had ever offered. They offered partnership. In the observer section, Captain Morrison finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the silent chamber. Commander Vexthel speaks the truth. We did not come here to threaten anyone. We came to offer an alternative to the old ways of doing things. Lieutenant Watson stood and addressed the council. Humans have learned that war is not the answer to our differences. But we have also learned that sometimes you must be willing to fight to protect what matters. We fought not to conquer, but to survive. We won not through superior firepower, but through superior cooperation. The chamber erupted in whispered conversations as delegates turned to each other, their various languages creating a symphony of confusion and concern. Commander Vexthel raised his voice above the noise. This is why I requested this session. Not to frighten you, but to educate you. Humans are not the primitive species you believe them to be. They are something new, something that represents both the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge our galaxy has ever faced. The commander's 3 eyes focused on Chancellor Zephron. You can choose to see them as a threat and repeat the mistakes that I made. You can try to suppress them, control them, eliminate them. But if you do, you will create an enemy more dangerous than anything the galaxy has ever seen. Vexthel's armor caught the light one final time as he straightened to his full height. Or you can choose to see them as an opportunity. An opportunity to build something better than what we have had before. An opportunity to create a galaxy based on cooperation rather than domination, on justice rather than power, on hope rather than fear. The commander turned one last time to look at the human representatives. The choice is yours, members of the council. But choose wisely, because humans have learned something that we forgot long ago. They have learned that ordinary people working together can accomplish extraordinary things. And once that lesson spreads to other species, to other worlds, to other civilizations, nothing will ever be the same again. The chamber fell into complete silence. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. Finally, Chancellor Zephron spoke, his voice barely audible. "Commander Vexthal, you have given us much to consider. The Council will deliberate on your testimony. And the implications of human participation in galactic affairs?" The commander nodded once. "That is all I can ask, Chancellor. But remember this, humans are no longer the species that first left their homeworld. They have become something else. Something that we helped create through our own actions. The question now is whether we are wise enough to learn from our mistakes or doomed to repeat them.